Hello, all. Happy Thursday evening. How's everybody doing in November? I'm doing pretty good. I hope that my internet connection remains stable because it's kind of storming here in Atlanta, Georgia. Uh-oh. Anna can't hear me. Okay. Okay. So maybe it's just Anna. Thank you, Maria. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started talking about characters and relationships. Um, yeah, that's good advice. Thank you, Selena. So I'm going to really start at the beginning because I think that characterization is something that it's one of those things that it feels like, oh, I know this. I've been doing it forever. But then when it gets to kind of an AP level, then it starts to be a little harder. You have to dive deeper into texts. So I'm going to really start with the basics, and then we'll do a little practice. Just look at some character descriptions and talk about how we might analyze those, and then talk about what that looks like on the AP exam. So, of course, I feel like I started a little bit early, but we're here. We're talking about characters and relationships. That's all that you missed. So, of course, if you're not following Think Fiveable, why aren't you? What are you doing with your life? I'm sure that all of you are. That's how you constantly end up here, and that's fantastic. It's an important relationship, and I think, if nothing else, it's a little entertaining in those times when school, everybody has the same cycles of school, so it's nice to be part of a greater community. Just some things coming up. Next Thursday, we're going to have Finding Theme Through Characterization. So for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking more about the Q3. So we're going to have a Q3 overview the Thursday after that. And we're going to have a bye. I just like using that word. But we're not going to have any stream on Thanksgiving, but we might have one the Wednesday before. But we'll be kind of sitting in a Q3 area for a while, talking about theme, talking about connecting other elements to theme as we end the semester in most places, whether that's in December or January or before or after. So today I'm going to always 8 p.m. Yes, Selena, always 8 p.m. I'm sorry. So all of those will be 8 p.m. The Wednesdays and the Thursdays. Except for Thanksgiving, we will always have a stream on Thursday and some Wednesdays. I know that there was a little snafu last night, so I apologize about that. But you can count on a Thursday and check the schedule for Wednesdays. I'm going to try to create a stronger thread between the streams for the next few weeks, because I know that people are going into finals and they're wrapping things up, and probably in your classes you've been exposed to every kind of question, so we can dive a little deeper into the different questions. So yes, every Thursday AP Lit will stream at 8 p.m. It won't always be the same person, but that's the fun of it, right? Also, I'm going to ask you this again at the end, but be thinking about what you would like to see, like what is going on in class that you might need some support in. I'm going to ask you to drop that in the chat at the end, or whenever you think of it, just kind of label like, hey, I'd like a stream on blank, because I think it's coming up to the time when we really want to know how things are working for you all and how we can be better. Okay, so I'm going to talk about characterization, some basic terms. Then I'm going to talk about where and how it shows up on the AP Lit exam. Spoiler alert, everywhere. And then I'm going to talk about a kind of character relationships and how you can figure out who those are, and really kind of what questions to ask yourself as you're reading. So because of the stream, I'm going to focus on shorter passages, but I do want you to be thinking about how to apply this to longer fiction for the literary argument essay. So first of all, characterization. We know what characterization is, but one of my favorite definitions of it is it's the method of making characters seem like real people with motivations and beliefs. And so I think that one thing that helps us analyze character is if we think about characters like real people, based on the people that I know, like, does this make sense for this character to do? And if it doesn't make sense, if this is not in line with what I know about characters, then why would the author create this anomaly? And so I think this is my favorite definition as opposed to the method of creating or developing characters, because it reminds us that art imitates life, that literature really is commentary on life. And so in order for us to be able to take themes from literature, we need to be able to make it feel like real. And so all of the things that authors create and do with the characters, all the things that they have them say, are choices to create real people and develop them well so that we believe that they would do something that they would do. Because characterization is one of those things where if you run into somebody who's like, you think you know this person, you're like, oh, that's like my friend Kelly, and so they continue to act like Kelly, and then they make a really un-Kelly decision. It's like, should I believe this? And if I don't believe it, then why don't I? And so that's the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about when we're analyzing characters, why they do what they do, and how the author creates the expectations for what they'll do. So of course, there's direct characterization and indirect characterization. I didn't even give a definition for direct characterization because we know what it is. It's when the author tells us directly, to use the word in the definition, who the person is, what they look like, what they do. But indirect characterization has a stronger emotional impact because, again, that's how we get to know people. When you first meet a person, they don't necessarily say to you, hello, I have anger management problems and I'm very sensitive about the wrinkles on my elbow. Those are the kinds of things that you find out as you get to know someone. And so that's how strong character development happens. Characters are unfolded, I think, beyond their physical description, their physical description or what they actually look like and say. Point of view is really important in characterization because if you're reading something with first person narration, that gives you deep insight into one person, but also helps you understand how you're supposed to see other characters. And so I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but first person is almost always an unreliable narrator. And so an unreliable narrator is a term that maybe you know already, but it implies that we can't believe what this narrator is saying. We can't believe it kind of wholly. We have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt because there's something that impairs that narrator. And sometimes that's just because that narrator is human, so we don't always see people clearly. We don't always see ourselves clearly. That's part of being human. And so a first person narrator is going to only allow you to see through their eyes, and those are going to be flawed. So, but a really unreliable narrator will be someone who tells you that they're a liar, like Holden Caulfield, if you've read The Catcher in the Rye, or a Hunter S. Thompson book or something. Like when somebody's constantly impaired, we know that they're unreliable. And so we have to take everything that they say, we have to look through their lens, but we also have to kind of decide whether or not we believe them. So if an author chooses to write in first person, that's going to definitely create a bias that we have to wade through a little more deeply and critically. A foil is a character whose contrast with another character highlights the attributes of one or both. I'm going to come back to that a little later. And then dynamic characters are often the protagonist, characters who develop and change. Sometimes we know that a protagonist is a protagonist because they are the character who develops and changes. And so one of my favorite examples of a protagonist who doesn't seem like a protagonist, or a protagonist who's not a hero, is any of the movies about the Joker. So The Dark Knight, there I am. The Dark Knight is one of my favorite films ever, but also a really good example of how a protagonist is you know that it's a protagonist because of your investment in the dynamism of the character, but you don't expect it to be because he's not the hero, you know. So sometimes people have a really hard time distinguishing between hero and protagonist, and that's the way to do it. So that's kind of the, you know, basic overview. Some of that might have been review, all of it might have been review, but just kind of making sure that we're all dealing with the same kind of definitions of what characters are and what they do and how we know. And characterization is all inference. So it's all figuring out based on my own personal experiences, plus what I'm given in this novel, like who is this person? Who does this person remind me of? Who is this? How is this person relate to my own aspirations of self? That kind of thing. And that's why it's easy. It's simple. I won't say it's easy. It's simple to say that the age of a protagonist is usually similar to the age of the target demographic to read it, because we like to relate. We like to find a connection that helps us understand. And it doesn't mean that you only read books with protagonists your age, because I like reading young adult fiction, and I haven't been a young adult for some time. But I also like reading about people completely different than me. It's just that helps to create a similarity that an entry point. So I'm going to read this little short passage that might be familiar to you if you have read The Great Gatsby. It is from the very beginning of the first page of The Great Gatsby. And so the narrator is talking about himself. And so I wanted to kind of use a first person example, because I think, again, it creates investment. It increases investment in that character when we hear a character talk about him or herself and figure out how true it is. So that's what I want us to be thinking about. The question to consider is, who is this person? How would you describe this person? And so as I read, I want you to drop some adjectives into the chat, so we can talk about who this person is, and then we'll talk about how we know. And again, whether or not this person is reliable and why we think yes or no. That's a lot of questions, but basically it's going to stay at the top. Who is this narrator? And then I'm going to ask you how you know. This is advice he got from his father. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. We've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope. So the question is, who is this narrator? And you can answer that in as many words as you'd like, but think about how you would describe this person. While you think, I'm going to disappear for just a moment because I forgot to bring my power cord in the room. So you drop the adjectives, I'll be right back. Is everybody afraid to describe our friend Nick? There we go, overthinking. Good. Critical. So here's a sub question that I'm going to look at the answer to. Curious. A sub question is there a difference between who he proclaims to be, how he describes himself, and how we see him? So for example, Honor Julia says he's curious. Is that what we see, or is that what he says about himself? And also in contrast, right, to think about Olivia calling him critical, and whether or not those can exist together, and whether or not he would think he's either of those. So we see that from his own words, he says that he reserves judgment. He says that more than once in just this little part of a paragraph. At the beginning, he says he's inclined to reserve all judgments. And then at the end, he says reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. But does he, in this passage, judge people? Right. So we see him. Yes, thank you, ladies. So we see him making really kind of harsh judgments about people. He's as Olivia says, he's critical, not of himself for judging people, although he's supposed to not, but we see him avoid people's confidences, right? Knowing that he says that his habit of reserving judgment has opened up many curious natures. And so that seems pretty neutral. Curious natures, okay, people are curious, or he's curious about them. But then he says that the confidences are unsought and that he has pretended to sleep. So people come to him and they are plagiaristic and suppressing. And hello, Magic Mike. They're plagiaristic and suppressing, and they are curious. That is not necessarily neutral once we see who he is. And that actually he does not reserve judgment at all, that he judges the people who bring their problems to him, their intimate revelations, and that he doesn't really actually want to hear them, which implies that he's not very honest about himself. And so we see that just in the discrepancy, right? In the separation of how we see him and how he sees himself. And so obviously that's a choice made by the author to show us that we can't really trust what Nick says from page 1, because he considers himself to be someone who is very open and unjudgmental. But the way that he talks about the people that come to him because of that supposed characteristic, alleged characteristic, he really is quite judgmental about them. And so he's a little condescending. He's a little superior. He's, as someone said before, he's critical, and maybe overthinking and maybe underthinking, right? So maybe he's not very realistic about who he actually is. And maybe he's projecting an image of non-judgmentality that isn't really true. And so we see that because this is first person, and because we are deep into his head, that allows us to see that contradiction. And so that's something that happens in a first person situation, because we're allowed to see the insight, we're allowed to make insights and see insights because of the way that the narration is delivered. And so that's something to really consider especially when it's a first person situation, because first person is always limited. I only know what I think. I can only tell you what I see, right? If you're looking through my eyes, you're only going to see my life. And so that leaves a lot to be inferred about whether or not I'm true, whether or not I'm believable. And so that's how unreliable narrators are established. And so he's not necessarily dishonest, and he's not impaired. It's not like he's, a drunk. Although if you've seen the latest movie, there was even though he's unreliable, even though he's not established to be a liar. He's not, the narration doesn't tell us that he lies. The narration doesn't tell us that it doesn't tell us that he projects an image that's untrue or unreal, and he's not impaired. He's not under the influence of anything. But we see that he's unreliable because we have found the discrepancy between the way he describes himself and the way that he actually is. So, I was going to say, so in the last movie, which I really love, the choice was made by the director and the writers to put him into a rehabilitation psychiatric treatment center. Then maybe he's an alcoholic, and I feel like that's something that definitely, if that had been in the book, he would have definitely established him as an unreliable narrator in the beginning. To say that anything we see through his eyes is going to be under the influence or impaired. And so I feel like that was a artistic choice that I can see how they might have extrapolated that. I don't really like it because I think that it makes him less human. But that's just a note on movie adaptations. Okay, so we've been introduced to Nick. We've seen Nick, and this is how Nick talks about himself versus the way that Nick talks about others. Can I repeat the last 10 minutes? I don't think so, but you are more than welcome to visit the replay. So if we think about how this is going to show up, how this skill of analyzing characters is going to show up, it would show up first in a multiple choice question. So thinking about all that we said, all that you said, that he is judgmental, that he thinks he's not, that people come to him with their problems, but he's not necessarily desirous of hearing them. And that's something that we inferred based on the way he talked to them. So here's a question for you, a multiple choice question, AP-ish, AP styled, not it's AP-ish. So here's the question. The narrator's perspective throughout the passage might be described as that of A, a willing listener, B, a dissembling gossip, that should be A, not Anne, C, a reluctant therapist, D, an accommodating confidant, or E, an omniscient narrator. We have some famous people in the stream tonight. Magic Mike and Donald Trump. We have a spectrum of responses. All right, so let's talk through this for a moment because we have quite a few E's, quite a few A's, and a couple C's, a few C's. And so A is a willing listener. If anybody's if anybody would like to explain why they think he's willing, why they think he's a willing listener, can you drop that in the chat? I know that I need to go back and forth between the passage and the question, but a willing listener, a reluctant therapist, and an omniscient narrator. Those are the three answers that we got. And so omniscient means that it's all knowing, right? So that's the way that omniscient works, and that's usually a third person narrator, because as I said, it's a first person narrator. It's impossible for me to know the thoughts of others, right? I only know what they say. I know how they impact me. And so Nick is not an omniscient narrator, because just based on the fact that he's speaking from the I, lets us know that he can't know, he's not going to know everything. So I'm going to go back to the passage really quickly. If anybody can show me, so we're the funny thing is, sorry, back and forth. So we're going between a willing listener and a reluctant therapist. And so if anybody can find text evidence to show that he is either willing or reluctant, drop that in the chat. Oh, when we only see his thoughts, that's limited. Thank you for that question, Lucy. So the opposite, kind of, the literary opposite of omniscient is limited. No problem. And so really, unless we're speaking from the first person of a mind reader or a divine person, it's going to be unlikely that we have omniscient first person. So again, we're looking for evidence that he's reluctant or evidence that he's willing. And maybe you said willing and now you think reluctant, now that you're looking for evidence, and that's fine. But I'm just going to drop it in reluctant or willing, and then a colon and some evidence. It's okay to support a wrong answer, because we don't know what the right answer is yet. I have not confirmed he's either willing or reluctant. So this question is asking us about the actual perspective, what we would analyze the perspective to be. And so we need to use the evidence that we have found as readers, as opposed to the evidence that he has told us as a narrator. Because again, we see that what he thinks of himself and what he shows us are not the same. So in the line about the confidences, so in the kind of middle after the ellipses, or after the second ellipses. So if you don't understand, what exactly can I repeat for you, Donald Trump? And I would be happy to do so. So we've seen that he says he reserves judgment again. He says that twice. In the middle, it says most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity. And so feign means that you're faking, right? So it's not real. So he's pretended to sleep. He's pretended to be doing something else. He's pretended some hostility so that people would not share their intimate revelations with him, because he doesn't really want to hear them. So the answer then is that he's a reluctant therapist. People bring their problems to him, but he doesn't really want to hear that. And again, that is something that was revealed through the discrepancy between who he is and who he says that he is, because again, he claims to reserve judgment. And so there's a question, are specific questions about the narrator a major part of the test? And so specific, you might get a multiple choice question frames just like this one. So that's one of the reasons that I used it. So you might get multiple choice questions about narrators, yes. You might get multiple choice questions about characters that are or are not the narrator. And then, as I'm going to show you a little later, there are ways that the essays are going to ask you about analysis of a narrator or character. So that's why I use this kind of practice, because it shows up, narrators and characters show up in multiple ways and in multiple points throughout the exam, as we're going to see in a moment. I'm sorry, so reluctant means that you aren't very willing. So I think that's a good question, Rebecca. And again, so yes, so sometimes, exactly, thank you, Olivia. So reluctant means that you're not willing, and dissembling means that you are not honest. But the reason why I didn't go into that before was because we haven't seen that he's a gossip. So there's no evidence that he's a gossip. So we knew that B was not the answer, even if we didn't know dissembling. But it is one of my favorite words. It basically means that you are not fully honest. Like, you might not be a whole liar, but you figure out how to tell untruths, or you often omit things that are truthful. So again, one of the most important parts of a test like this is going to be vocabulary and whether or not you can figure out answers without knowing words. So good job, though, in knowing that he wasn't a gossip and that he wasn't accommodating. So we didn't have B or D at all. Marianne asks, can evidence be when most of, oh, yes. That was from when we were talking about the answer to the question, can the evidence be most of the time that he feigned sleep? That's exactly right, Marianne. All right, so if we are moving forward, so again, talking about where it might show up on the AP exam. And so that's one of the ways that it's going to show up is in multiple choice questions. Another way that it's going to show up is in prose analysis. And it might show up in poetry, but not as much. So these two prose analysis prompts are from a few years back, but I just wanted to give you an example of how character shows up, because often the prose analysis prompts are going to be about analyzing a character. So this one is about two people. In the passage, Rosamund and Tertius litigate, a recently married couple, which is going to probably be complex, confront financial difficulties. Read the passage carefully, then write a well-developed essay in which you analyze how Eliot portrays these two characters and their complex relationship as husband and wife. So in this way, you need to not only understand the characterization of each person, but also how Eliot characterizes their interactions as a newly married couple. And so this is a very good example of the kind of layers of complexity of character that you're going to need to analyze on the exam, because you might be asked to analyze a complex relationship is a phrase that's found quite often on the second question, on the prose question. And so you want to constantly be thinking about who is each person, and then how do we watch them interact. And then another example is in a well-organized essay from 2014, analyze how the author reveals the character of Moses. And so that seems much more straightforward, but that's kind of the tricky part. If you only are analyzing one person, you're going to need to do that very deeply. And so you're going to need to understand not only who the person is, but how the author has shown you. So here is an example, another little passage to practice on, an example of a prose passage actually from an AP exam. I mean, it's just a piece, but in this case, we're looking not only at who the character is, but how we've been shown. Because if you look at that second prompt, it says you may wish to consider such literary elements as point of view, which we spoke about earlier, selection of detail and imagery. And so you need to think about how the techniques that you're accustomed to, how those how those things establish a character, because we don't always think about imagery telling us about a character. We think more about how they interact with others. And so I want us to look at this next passage and think about how the language that is used tells us how it adds to the characterization. Uh-oh. My slide won't advance. Oh, now we've gone too far. Rebecca had a great suggestion in the questions, so I think I've done that. Okay, here we go. Oh, so another question, and this is an actual, like I said, this is an actual passage, or a piece of it. Of course, it was longer than that. But the question is, if we get a question like this, will the passage be included or just the name of the book? And so if you get a question, like the multiple choice question, I'm not sure if that's what you're asking. The multiple choice question would be based on the passage, and they probably would not tell you the name of the book. And if you get a prose analysis question, you probably would be given the name of the book, but you would only be using the passage that is given. I hope that that answered your question. Again, will the passage be included or just the name of the book? So you're only going to get a passage for the multiple choice and the prose analysis. Okay, good. So here we get a description of a character named Coyle. And the prompt says, write an essay in which you analyze how the use of language generates a vivid impression of Coyle as a character. And so I wanted to give you just these two little paragraphs because we learn a lot about Coyle in these two paragraphs, one that is only a sentence, but we also need to think about how it is that we learn about Coyle. So not only what we learn about Coyle, but how we learn it. So here's an account of a few years in the life of Coyle, born in Brooklyn and raised in a shuffle of dreary upstate towns. Hive-spangled, gut-roaring with gas and cramp, he survived childhood. At the State University, hand clapped over his chin, he camouflaged torment with smiles and silence. Stumbled through his 20s and into his 30s, learning to separate his feelings from his life, counting on nothing. He ate prodigiously like the ham knuckle, buttered spuds. Okay, so how would we describe Coyle? Our dynamic character, probably, okay, so while people are thinking about Coyle, thank you, Natalie, dynamic characters may or may not be included in multiple choice questions. You probably would not be asked whether or not a character is dynamic, but you would probably be shown some element of the dynamic nature of the character. So there aren't very many term questions anymore. They're not going to ask, which character is dynamic in the passage, or is a character dynamic even. But you would be expected to be able to analyze. And also, Natalie, not in multiple choice questions, but in an essay prompt, you would probably want to examine how a character evolves over time. Okay, so we've had some responses. Yes, thank you. So he seems to struggle with his life. Yes, he's unhappy. He's had a rough life. Two people said that at the same time. Jinx. He's learned to be cunning due to his harsh life. Santiago, can you say just a little bit more about that, or tell us where you see that? Because that's really insightful, I think. And so while you're writing, we're going to come back to how he's learned to be cunning, or how you see that. And so we see rough, right? We see physically rough with gas and cramp. And then something important to look at is the words that are used to describe, I think I went out and here I am, I'm back. I don't know if you missed any of my words. But we see that he was hive-spangled, which is not comfortable. Gut roaring with gas and cramp is not comfortable. We know that he lives in dreary towns, and so he's probably either going to reflect that dreariness or be very different from it. But what really stands out to me in terms of his childhood is the word survived, right? So this is where we get the implication that he barely made it, right, mentally or physically. And so he's had a rough life, absolutely. And we see that because he survived childhood, right? But he got through, he went to college. And so there's a little bit of tension between what he did and what we might expect, because he had such a hard time in childhood and came from a number of towns, but went to college and kind of survived that too, right? He camouflaged his torment. And so not only do we see that it's rough, but we see, thank you. So here we come back to Santiago's answer, that he has learned how to, as it says, camouflage, it says survive. He stumbled into his 20s and 30s, and that was your evidence, right? Learning to separate his feelings from his life. And so he has been hiding behind his hand over his chin. There's something going on with his chin. There's something going on with his gut. There's something going on with his face, right? And so he has, in many ways, learned how to hide, and he's learned how to project something different than what's actually going on. And so we see this, right? And so the deeper we can go into that, the more we can say about it, the better. Obviously, the stronger the analysis, but also think about how the diction of the description implies those things. And so again, how do we know that he has learned that he's resilient even, right? So if we say he's had a rough life, well, did he sink down to that rough life? Did he figure out coping mechanisms? He clearly figured out coping mechanisms. And so he's innovative, he's resilient, right? And we can make those inferences that are deeper than just kind of repeating what we've seen. And so if we were going to write about it, we can use words like survived and camouflage, right, in thank you, Lucy, in response to a dreary life. And so he's lived a dreary life. However, right, he's come out, and then we have Santiago's evidence about learning to separate his feelings from his life. And so when we're analyzing characters, and I wanted to use this one because it's not like the previous one where what we see is different than what we're told, but what we see is so much more than what we're told. And so we would want to draw on what we infer rather than repeat what we've seen. And so to say he had a hard life and have evidence like that his gut was roaring with gas and cramp, which sounds like a very difficult situation, especially as a child. So we can say he's had a hard life, and that is true. And that is an inference because it doesn't say he had a rough life. But when we start to dive deeper into the paragraph and talk about what that did for him and how he came out of that and what he learned from it, then we're making more strong analysis because we're using stronger inferences based on what we understand about the person. And then after all that, we think he's growing up and we think he's maturing, and then all of a sudden we're talking about how he ate. And so that's another kind of thing and so again, thinking about the definition of characterization from the beginning, about how characterization is the method by which authors make characters seem real. This is a real man. Like this is he feels like a real person because there's no polish about him, right? It's not like, oh, that's too good to believe. He might even be too bad to believe. But we know people who, have bad skin and bad gas. Like that's a thing. We get it. And so when we consider what that's meant for him in his life, then we come up with things like resilient or cunning or the resultant ideas. And that's what we really want to dive into. And that's how we talk about how the language generates a vivid impression, because we would pull words like dreary. Yes, thank you, Lucy. Words like stumbled through his 20s, and we would infer that he is therefore cunning. And so that's all how we connect that evidence to the commentary, right? And so those are really great pulls. So again, this is why we need to think about characterization as we read, because it could be the prompt. And obviously, if the prompt says for you to analyze how the use of language, and italicize that because that's what you're going to focus on, right? If you're going to analyze how the use of language generates a vivid impression, then as you read, obviously you're looking for the language and the vivid impression of Coyle as a character, but it's not going to be, you're not going to report back, right, what you read. You're going to have to decide what that means about him as opposed to what you saw. So what you read is the evidence, obviously, and then what you understand from it about him is the commentary, and that's how you get your evidence and commentary points. All right, so we've looked at how it shows up, how characters show up in multiple choice, how characters show up in Q2, and then how characters show up in Q3. So the last thing that I just want to look at is how the literary argument prompts are going to ask you to analyze character. And so here are some examples. Looking at the first one, it says choose a novel or play, which that's what you're always going to have to do for the third question, the third essay. Choose a novel or play in which cultural, physical, or geographical surroundings, and then here's the important part, shape psychological or moral traits in a character. Then write a well-organized essay in which you analyze how surroundings affect this character and illuminate the meaning of the work as a whole. And so I'm about to dive into this, but the literary argument is going to ask you to make an argument, period. It's going to ask you to make an argument about some sort of concept, issue, topic, and the meaning of the work as a whole. And so this is the way that character works in the Q3s. It's going to ask you to examine some concept, like kind of through the lens of a character. And so it's going to tell you, it's very rarely is it going to ask you to write about more than one character. It's going to, and it's probably going to be protagonist because that's what you'll have the most to say about. But in this case, you have to think about, first you have to choose cultural, physical, or geographical surroundings, but you're thinking about how the surroundings has shaped the character. So you're going to have to argue what those surroundings are, right? That's not the argument, but you're going to have to argue how those surroundings have shaped the character and think about how the character might have been different in different surroundings. And so that, again, that's one of those ones that's really kind of multi-layered because you have to think of the surroundings. You have to think of surroundings that have shaped the character. You have to figure out how psychologically the character was shaped. And so this can get really difficult. And it's one of the reasons why you want to walk into the exam having a few books under your belt. And so that you don't have to spend a lot of time figuring out, well, who am I going to write about? And so, again, you want to go into the exam, and I know the exam is far off, but you want to go into the exam having novels that you know really well, and therefore characters that you know really well and that you can write about. Another example of character in the literary argument prompt is choose a novel or play in which a central character leaves home, yet finds that home remains significant. So that's important. That's going to be very specific, right? And so there are lots of people who leave home, but the home doesn't always remain significant. So you have to figure out who that character is. And then you're going to write a well-developed essay in which you analyze the importance of home to this character and the reasons for its continuing influence. And then explain how the character's idea of home illuminates the larger meaning of the work. And so again, it's always going to come back to meaning of the work as a whole. So when you see that a literary argument prompt is about character in particular, it's going to be asking you to analyze the impact of the issue, whether, in those last two, one was home, one was geographical surroundings, cultural surroundings, the impact of that concept on the character. And so you have to be able to, in your response, make a clear argument about this is how the character was impacted by the concept that I was given. It's going to ask you to analyze the impact. It's going to ask you to establish the effect of the interaction on the novel itself. So what does the character and his or her sense of home have to do with what happens in the book? And then analyze how the character and concept contribute to or illuminate the meaning of the work as a whole. Because you're always going to have to come back to theme. You can't leave that out. You can't just write about the character's surroundings and how that impacted the character. You're going to have to take that out to a broader view and explain how that impacted the meaning of the work as a whole and how that relates to anybody's life, not just this character. And so your response is going to have to do those things. It's going to have to make a clear argument. And so the tricky thing in writing is not to just write a characterization analysis, right? You can't just write about who the character is or even who the character is in the relationship to home, but it's going to have to take that further and further out. And so you're going to have to remember for your evidence specific plot points, events in the book that showed the impact of the concept on the character. And so that kind of leads to Martha's question from earlier. Martha asked, can the commentary be wrong? And the commentary can be wrong. It's more likely that there are multiple ways for the commentary to be right. And so if we're looking at Coyle, for example, from that passage that I just had, if we're looking at him, your commentary would be wrong if it's not supportable by the evidence. And so that's why I asked Santiago to come up with a piece of evidence to support what he said, because his argument was fantastic, right? And so everything that anyone said about Coyle was absolutely supportable by the passage. And so that was great. But you need to be able to explain it. And so that connection is going to be what is wrong or right. And sometimes your connection can get a little twisted. It can be like an internet connection, unstable, right? That the reader of your essay is not able to see the thread that you've drawn between what you read and what you're arguing. So again, your response is going to make an argument. You have to make sure that your evidence is from the novel, but that you do not leave your argument there. And that is the tricky part about Q3, is that you have to use the plot, and a long time ago, and they've stopped saying it already, let alone with the new prompt, but they used to say, do not summarize the plot because readers don't want to see plot summaries, right? We may or may not have read the book, but this is not where we want you to tell us a plot summary. And in a character-based prompt, you have to write about more than just the character, right? We can't just write that Gatsby was this kind of person, but have to think about what home meant to him, how that is revealed through the characterization, and how that connects to the meaning of the work as a whole. So it's a pretty layered response that you're going to have to create. And so this is an excellent question. Ana Julia asked, can our response have a 0 in the thesis, but still receive a point in commentary? And it's tough, but it's possible. So you could have a thesis that is not strong enough to get a thesis point. Or you never really establish the argument that you're making. However, you do have analysis of the text that would earn you points in commentary. You're not going to get all the evidence and commentary points if you don't have a thesis, because part of the evidence and commentary points is about supporting your thesis. But that's a really great question. You can write yourself into commentary that would earn you a point or two without having established a thesis. But it's going to have to be very, very strong, the commentary that you make. And you wouldn't be able to earn them all because of the way that the points are structured. So would I recommend not having a thesis? Absolutely not. Is that what you meant, Maria? Um, I do think that very often, if you don't, so two things. One, I think often you can write yourself into commentary that would earn you a point. And so I would recommend writing, even if you're not sure what you're going to say. Yes, I would recommend beginning to write. But my caveat to that is that I would really recommend that if you're not sure what you're about to argue, that you begin writing and leave space for a thesis, even just at the top of your paper. Or once you've realized what you're arguing, that you make sure that you have a thesis somewhere, like in the conclusion, that you, if you've written yourself into an argument, that you establish that argument. Because in order to get the point, it doesn't have to be in the beginning. That's where most people put it, but it doesn't have to be in the beginning. If they can, if your reader can point, if your reader can identify that you have established an argument, that you have written that as what your entire essay will be centered around, then you can get that thesis point. So I wouldn't recommend not having a thesis, but I also would not recommend waiting until you have a thesis to start writing if you're having trouble. And so again, I would say start writing and you will realize what you're writing about, and then make sure that you stamp that and have a sentence or two that establishes, you know, not say this is my argument, but a sentence or two that establishes your succinct answer to the prompt. And that it's very possible, and definitely happens often, that you write yourself into your argument. And so you would want to write that later. I hope that that answered your question. Okay, good. All right, so we have 4 minutes, and I had one more. Okay, yeah. So just a couple more things to think about when you are reading for character analysis. That one, there's a term called foil, and I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with this, but a foil, as I said earlier, is a character whose contrast with another character highlights the attributes of one or both. And that really is kind of important if you're trying to analyze a relationship. And so you want to think about, so if you've read The Crucible, so Elizabeth was like really pure, she was married, she was older, she was established, she was mature, she was religious. And then Abigail was like everything, all those opposites, right? She was young, she was, I guess, sexy. She was a seductress. She was, as I said earlier, and we learned the word dissemble. This is actually where I learned that word. She was a dissembler. She's not honest. She's not religious. And so the more that Elizabeth is good, the more we see how bad Abigail is, and vice versa. And so that's how foils work. And I always think about aluminum foil, like how you use it in the oven because it like reflects the heat. And so they, it's like a funhouse mirror version of each other though, because they're not going to reflect each other. They're going to show how opposite they are. And so it's not going to be black and white, but it's definitely going to be, you know, like purple and yellow. Like you're going to see the yellower one gets, the more purple the other sees, if that makes sense on the color wheel. And so an example of that is Elizabeth and Abigail. If you've read Othello, Iago and Othello are also similar. The more conspiratorial and wily Iago is, the more honest and straightforward Othello seems. And then also the crazier Othello seems, the more sane Iago seems, even though that's really the opposite. And in the same way, Desdemona is, again, like Elizabeth, you know, pure and unknowing. And Emilia is in the conspiracy with everyone else. And so as those characters are developed, you see how one really shows the other. And a lot of times somebody's going to be a foil to the protagonist, excuse me. And so obviously an important relationship is the protagonist and the antagonist. How they conflict is something that you want to pay attention to. And so how that relationship is developed, and then also how each character is developed individually. And so I'm kind of rushing because I have like 40 seconds. But just be thinking constantly as you read about how a character, especially the protagonist, how a character interacts with other people and what that says about their own development. Yes, so Rebecca asked the question that I should have seen that before because that was a great segue. Absolutely. So like the protagonist and the antagonist, they're not necessarily foils, but a lot of times that there are. And so it's very unlikely, Marianne, that they will ask you about a foil, although it's possible, but I think it's already happened, so they probably wouldn't do it again. But it's something to remember. So if you, for example, maybe the prompt is about someone who is violent, right? And so you would, to deepen your analysis, you could write about someone else in the book who is very peaceful, or a pacifist. And so how that kind of illuminates the violence of the protagonist, or vice versa. So maybe the character that you're writing about is very peaceful, but they had a very violent parent or something. And so that foil relationship is going to enhance the attributes of both characters. So time really flies when you are discussing characters and having characters in the stream. That was kind of crazy for a moment. Time flies when this happens. So our hour is up, but if you have any questions that I can hit upon really quickly in relation to characterization, or the AP Lit exam speaking on characterization or asking about characterization, go ahead and drop that. And other than that, that's a wrap. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation, and thank you for what is the word? Tolerating what was going on in the stream for a moment. But just a little unexpected wildness on a November night. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you for participating. Have a great night. Happy Thursday. Have a great weekend. Be good, be safe. And we'll see you next Thursday, 8:00, as we dive into finding theme through characterization. Good night. Thanks all.